In this video, I want to show you how to simply Dockerize a Django project that uses Postgresql as the database. Then, I'll show you how to use Docker to run the project in AWS in simple steps. But first, let's see the big picture. So first, we have a Django project that we can run locally. But using Docker makes it easier to configure everything and run it anywhere we want. So we simply create a Docker file including the steps needed to run the project. Now for the Postgresql database, we can simply use an existing Postgresql Docker image. So we don't need to create a Docker file for that. Simply we have to separate services on Docker, one for our project, the other for Postgresql. We use the docker compose.yml file to combine these two services so that they can communicate with each other. Now that we have the project, Docker file, and docker compose.yml, we just need to move them to an EC2 server and execute the docker compose.yml file there to run the project. Okay, with this big picture in mind, let's do it step by step. Step 1. First of all, let's create a Django project from scratch. We need to make sure we have Python 3 installed along with pip. It's recommended that you create a Python environment either with venv or virtual env. However, it's not really necessary if you can already install Django with global pip. Create a Django project with django-admin start project. Now go into the root of the project and run it simply with python manage.py run server. You should see the sample website in the resulting URL. Now let's create a requirements.txt file to keep the modules we're using in the project and their versions to make the module installations easier. At the moment, the Django project uses the default local SQLite database, so there's no need to configure Postgresql at this stage. In step 2, let's Dockerize the project. Simply create a Docker file in the root, including the following info, or you can just copy and paste it from the GitHub repo in the description. First, with the from line, we specify the Python Docker image version. We want to use version 3.12 running on Ubuntu. Then set the working directory inside a container. We need this line to install packages related to Postgresql, even though we might not need it at this point. It's a good idea to just add it here for later. In this line, we copy the requirements.txt file into the working directory inside a container, and using the run pip install line, install the needed packages. Now copy the whole project inside a container. Finally, set the exposed port for Django and run the development server. Without needing Docker compose file at this point, we can simply run Docker build to build the project, then use Docker run to run the Django project. So far so good. But now it's time to use the Postgresql Docker image for the DB instead of the local SQLite database. Step 3. Since we're going to have different Docker services running and communicating together, we need the Docker Compose configuration. First, let's configure the Django settings to make it work with the Postgresql database. A better practice is to use environment variables for sensitive data like the DB username and password. But for now, to keep things simple, we'll simply enter it here. Feel free to use any database name or password, but use Postgres for the username. Also, we need the psychopg2 module for Django to be able to use the Postgresql database. So don't forget to add it to the requirements.txt file. Step 4. It's time to combine the Docker services. Create a Docker compose file, and in the services, first add the configuration for the web service, which is our Django project. We use the root of the project for building it. For both internal and external ports, we use 8000. This means that we map port 8000 on the local machine to port 8000 inside a container. The first port is for the local machine, and the second one is for inside a container. To keep the project files in sync with the project inside a container, we use volumes. We can have an environment configuration here when we use environment variables to set the DB info in the Django settings file. But you can skip it here. Adding depends on is very important because it makes it wait for the DB service to run. You can also add the run command here again. Step 5. Now let's add the DB service. For the image configuration, we use the Postgresql Docker image name. In the environment section, we need to enter the DB username, password, and name. The good thing about using Docker here is that it's going to create the DB automatically for the first time. You can simply copy and paste the configuration from the GitHub repo linked in the description. Now it's time to test whether Docker Compose works or not. We just need to run this command, docker-compose up-build. First, it's going to build the services and then run them. If everything goes well, you'll be able to see the sample Django project up and running on port 8000. To make sure it works fine with the PostgreSQL database, we can simply create a superuser using Django create superuser command, and then try to log into the admin dashboard with the username and password you just created. If you can get inside, it means the integration works perfectly. Otherwise, you need to double check where the configuration is incorrect. Step 6. To be able to have the project in other servers like AWS EC2, you could just copy your project into the server with scp or rsync commands. However, the common way is to create a Git repository for the project, which makes it a lot easier to access the project from anywhere you want. So simply go to your GitHub account, create a new repository by choosing a good name and some description. Now, since we have an existing project on the local machine, we need to initialize Git for the project and then push it to this repository. However, I'm not going to explain each command one by one. You can simply use the instructions suggested by GitHub after you created the repo to do this. After pushing your code into the GitHub repo, it's time for step 7, which is the final step. After logging into your AWS dashboard, simply create an EC2 instance running on Ubuntu and with the minimum requirements. EC2 is a server just like our local server. We just need to connect to that. The common way is to use SSH. So here try to generate a key pair for that. The file format should be PEM. Download the file and keep it close because we're gonna need it soon. Go ahead with adding some simple group policy. Later, we will configure the group policies more carefully. After successfully creating the instance, go to the connect section and copy the IP of the instance. Go back to your terminal and use SSH command along with the address of your key file, followed by the instance user, which should be Ubuntu here, and the IP address. There's a good chance that you run into an error with regard to the PEM file. In this case, you need to change the permissions of the file using the chmod command. It is common to place the project under var folder, but it's entirely up to you. Now, in your desired directory, clone the GitHub repo we created before using the repo HTTP address. Update the Ubuntu app tool if needed. Then install the Docker tool and the Docker Compose. If you are not sure how to install them, you can simply search for them. Now start the Docker service with systemctl and make sure it's running. Let's get back to the EC2 security groups section to activate some ports. We need TCP port 8000 for the web service and TCP port 5432 for PostgreSQL. Finally, use docker-compose up-build like before to build and run our Docker services. It's time to check to see if it works or not. Go to your EC2 instance IP with port 8000. There's a high chance that you see this error page, which means that we need to add the instance IP to hosts in the Django settings file. So let's do it. Okay, let's try one more time. Amazingly, everything looks good so far. Let's create a super user to see if the web service can communicate with the DB service on the Docker. The commands are like before. Then go to the admin URL and enter your credentials for the super user. It seems that the connection is also okay. Well done. This was a quick overview of how to use Docker to run a Django project with a PostgreSQL DB on an AWS EC2 instance. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for the upcoming tutorials like this.